John Bodkin Adams was not the kind of doctor you would expect to fear. Born in Ireland in 1899, he appeared mild-mannered, polite, and deeply religious. He attended church regularly, quoted the Bible, and always wore a calm, almost saintly smile. But behind that gentle face was a man who would come to be accused of being one of Britain's most prolific killers. A doctor whose patients died in suspiciously large numbers, leaving him generous gifts and large sums of money. By the time the police finally took interest, more than 160 of his patients had died under questionable circumstances. What made the case even more terrifying was that he had been treating the wealthiest people in Eastbourne, an elegant seaside town known as a retreat for Britain's elderly elite. They trusted him completely, and that trust might have been fatal. Dr. Adams moved to Eastbourne in 1922 after finishing his medical training. He quickly became popular among elderly women, wealthy widows who felt comforted by his soft-spoken nature and constant availability. He made home visits at any hour of the day or night. He was the kind of doctor who would hold your hand while you cried, bring you flowers, and remind you that death was simply a peaceful sleep. Many of his patients adored him. Many also ended up dead. Over the years, local undertakers began to notice something strange. Dr. Adams signed an unusually high number of death certificates. His patients were often cremated quickly, sometimes with no post-mortem examination. Even stranger, many of them had changed their wills shortly before death, often leaving Dr. Adams money, cars, or expensive gifts. In one case, a wealthy widow left him her Rolls-Royce. In another, he was left antique furniture, jewelry, and even property. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, yet nobody dared to accuse him. He was a doctor, respected, even loved. Who would believe that a man of medicine could be a killer? Rumors spread quietly through Eastbourne. Some nurses whispered that Adams gave his patients morphine or heroin to help them rest, but in doses far higher than necessary. Others said he would visit the dying late at night, alone, and stay until they passed peacefully. The patients always died calmly, their faces serene. To outsiders, it looked like kindness. To those who watched closely, it felt like murder disguised as mercy. By the late 1940s, Adams had become extremely wealthy. He owned luxury cars, fine suits, and several properties. For a small-town doctor, his lifestyle was extravagant. But nobody questioned him. Not the police, not the families, and not the medical authorities. He had powerful friends, including judges, politicians, and church leaders. Eastbourne's upper class saw him as one of their own. That illusion began to crumble in 1956, when the death of Mrs. Edith Alice Morel drew attention. Mrs. Morel was a wealthy widow who had suffered stroke. Dr. Adams treated her for years, keeping her heavily sedated on powerful drugs. Nurses later testified that he injected her daily with morphine and heroin, far exceeding safe limits. They also said she was conscious enough to complain about it. She didn't want to die. But Adams kept increasing the doses, claiming he was only easing her pain. When she finally died, her estate was worth more than £170,000, an enormous sum for the time, and Adams was one of the beneficiaries. This time, people started asking questions. A nurse named Gertrude Brady went to the police and reported what she had seen. She said she was certain Dr. Adams had deliberately killed Mrs. Morel. The police opened a quiet investigation. What they found was shocking. More than 160 of Adams's former patients had left him something in their wills. Nearly all of them were wealthy, elderly women who had died under sedation. Detectives began to follow his movements, review medical records, and interview nurses. They discovered that Adams often visited his patients just before their deaths, and sometimes he would sign death certificates without even seeing the body. In one case, a patient died and Adams signed the certificate over the phone. He would mark the cause of death as natural causes or heart failure, and cremations would follow swiftly, leaving no evidence behind. In November 1956, after months of investigation, the police arrested Dr. Adams. He was charged with the murder of Mrs. Morel. The case exploded across Britain. Newspapers called him the Eastbourne Angel of Death. Reporters surrounded his home, and the public was both fascinated and horrified. Could this quiet country doctor really be a serial killer? Or was he being punished for simply helping his patients die peacefully? The trial began in 1957 at the Old Bailey in London. The courtroom was packed every day. Adams sat calmly, reading his Bible, smiling politely at journalists. The prosecution argued that he had deliberately killed Mrs. Morell with a lethal overdose, motivated by greed and a disturbing fascination with death. They presented witness after witness, nurses, pharmacists, and relatives, who described his strange behavior. One nurse said he would give injections even when the patient was already unconscious. Another testified that he joked about death, saying they're better off out of their misery. But Adams's defense team was brilliant. They argued that he was a compassionate doctor who had done his best to relieve suffering. The doses he gave, they said, were meant to ease pain, not cause death. The defense cleverly turned the case into a debate about medical ethics. When does easing pain become murder? The line between mercy and malice suddenly looked very thin. After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Against all expectations, Dr. John Bodkin Adams was found not guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted in gasps. He smiled quietly, bowed his head, and thanked God. Outside, he told reporters, "I have nothing to fear. My conscience is clear." However, the story did not end there. Though acquitted of murder, Adams was later convicted of forging prescriptions and lying on official documents. He lost his license to practice medicine for several years, but was never imprisoned for murder. The decision shocked Britain. Many believed he had escaped justice because of his wealth and influence. Some said the establishment had protected him, that convicting a respected doctor would damage the image of the medical profession. In the years that followed, new evidence emerged. Files from the Home Office suggested that senior officials had intervened in the case. There were whispers of cover-ups and destroyed documents. Even some police officers believed the truth had been buried to avoid scandal. One investigator later said, if Adams had been an ordinary man, he would have been hanged. Dr. Adams returned to Eastbourne after the trial, living quietly and continuing to attend church. But his reputation never recovered. To some, he was a gentle Christian doctor. To others, he was a cold, methodical killer who had hidden behind the mask of medicine. When he died in 1983 at the age of 84, he left behind a fortune and a trail of questions that may never be answered. Many historians now believe that John Bodkin Adams may have been one of the first modern serial killers, a man who killed not for pleasure, but for control. He had complete power over life and death, and he enjoyed it. Whether his actions were driven by greed, compassion, or a godlike sense of authority, one thing remains certain. Over 160 of his patients never woke up again. Even today, his case haunts the British medical system. It raised moral and ethical questions that remain unresolved. How far can a doctor go in easing pain? When does mercy become murder? And how many others like him might still hide behind the white coat of trust? John Bodkin Adams' story stands as a chilling reminder that evil often wears a calm and familiar face. He was not a monster in the shadows, but a man welcomed into the homes of the dying, a man trusted with their last breaths. His hands, steady and gentle, might have brought peace or silence. And perhaps that is what makes his story truly terrifying. It forces us to question not just him, but the fragile line between healing and harm, between faith and fear, and between comfort and control. If you want to hear more real stories of killers who hid behind masks of trust, power, and respectability, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more shocking stories to come.